Welcome. Take a moment to settle into your space, allowing your body to relax and your mind to soften. There is nothing you need to do, no place you need to go. Simply notice the quiet presence around you, the subtle flow of air, the gentle play of light across surfaces, and the natural rhythm of your own breath. As you listen, you may become aware of small, everyday details, the way sunlight drifts across a room, the soft sound of water moving quietly, the faint movement of leaves or fabric in still air. These moments, though simple, carry a sense of continuity, a calmness that unfolds slowly, without interruption. Over the next hours, you will drift through spaces untouched by urgency, observing the gentle persistence of objects, surfaces, and structures. Water continues along its familiar paths, light moves softly across walls and floors, and quiet traces of time settle gently over all things. You may notice how air moves subtly through open areas, how shadows stretch and contract with the passing day, and how small patterns of repetition appear naturally in nature and in built spaces. These details are not meant to command your attention, they exist quietly, simply and steadily, allowing your mind to release tension and sink into calm observation. In these first moments, as the day slows, you might notice your own senses becoming more attuned to subtle shifts, the faint rustle of leaves, the gentle warmth of light, the soft, almost imperceptible movement of air. Each moment blends into the next, without hurry, without expectation, without conclusion. Your mind can drift along with these quiet rhythms, feeling the natural cadence of presence and absence, form and space, light and shadow. Now, as you settle fully into this calm awareness, the surroundings begin to reveal themselves more clearly. Walls, objects, pathways, and light form gentle patterns, their subtle movements unfolding slowly and naturally. And in these spaces, you can simply exist, observing without effort, noticing without judgment, as the first quiet moments of the day's transition carry you gently toward the deeper calm that lies ahead. In those early years, as the hours of morning settled into their familiar order, the environment revealed itself without urgency. Light arrived gradually, spreading across rooftops and stone surfaces in muted tones, never demanding attention. Streets remained mostly empty, not because they were avoided, but because movement followed an unspoken rhythm, one that had repeated quietly over many seasons. Doors stayed closed a little longer, windows reflected the sky more than the interior, and the air carried a balanced mixture of cool shade and emerging warmth. Along the edges of walkways, dust rested undisturbed, shaped only by the faint passage of wind and the slow settling of particles carried from elsewhere. In courtyards and narrow passages, objects remained exactly where they had been left, buckets beside walls, wooden benches pressed gently into the ground beneath them, their placement suggesting routine rather than intention. Trees bordering the streets held their leaves still for long moments at a time, then allowed them to shift slightly, responding to air currents that were barely perceptible. The soundscape remained thin and distant, an occasional footstep softened by stone, a brief echo that faded almost as soon as it appeared. Water channels traced their paths alongside the roads, reflecting fragments of light and shadow in long, uneven patterns that changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. In those spaces, nothing competed for attention, and nothing needed to be completed. Time passed through repetition rather than progression, marked not by events, but by subtle adjustments in brightness, temperature, and the position of shadows along familiar surfaces. The scent of damp ground lingered beneath everything, mixed with faint traces of wood, clay, and metal warmed gently by the sun. Even when people moved through these areas, their presence blended into the background, leaving no sharp interruption behind them. The environment absorbed motion easily, returning quickly to stillness. As the hours continued, the balance between light and shade shifted again. Slightly longer stretches of brightness settling against walls and door frames, while darker areas withdrew into corners and recesses. Everything remained in a state of quiet maintenance, preserved by habit and continuity rather than effort. In those moments, the surroundings did not suggest change, only the steady continuation of patterns already in motion, patterns that had no clear beginning and did not yet indicate an end, allowing awareness to rest comfortably within the ongoing flow. As time continued to move through those same spaces, the atmosphere held its steady balance, neither advancing nor retreating in any noticeable way. The light, now more evenly distributed, rested along building faces and open ground, creating broad areas of calm illumination, interrupted only by the soft geometry of shadows. Paths showed faint traces of use, smoothened stone and compacted, earth shaped gradually by countless quiet crossings rather than by any single moment. In those years, routine expressed itself through placement rather than action, through the way objects occupied space without needing adjustment. Water jars remained near entrances, lids slightly askew, catching brief highlights before returning to dull reflection. Fabric hung from lines or railings moved only when the air allowed it, slow and unforced, its motion pausing naturally between shifts. The sound of distant activity arrived softened and indistinct, filtered through layers of walls and open air until it lost any clear source. In gardens and along edges of dwellings, plants grew according to the conditions available, leaves angled toward light, roots settling deeper into soil that had supported them across long intervals. The ground itself held warmth from earlier hours, releasing it gradually, creating subtle changes in temperature that registered more as comfort than sensation. Nothing required attention, and nothing indicated urgency. Even timekeeping devices, where they existed, seemed secondary to the environment's own pacing, which relied on repetition rather than measurement. As the day progressed, small shifts accumulated quietly, light sliding a little farther, shadows stretching slightly longer, surfaces adjusting without resistance. The environment retained every minor alteration without announcing it, absorbing change into continuity. People, when present, moved through these areas in alignment with the surroundings, their motion leaving no lasting disturbance. Once they passed, the spaces returned to their prior state almost immediately, as if designed to reset themselves. In those moments, awareness drifted easily from one detail to another, never settling long enough to demand interpretation. The balance between presence and absence remained stable, allowing the scene to persist without definition, without direction, and without any indication that it needed to arrive anywhere beyond where it already was. In those same stretches of time, the surroundings continued to hold their form with quiet consistency. The sky shifted subtly, clouds thinning and gathering again without drawing focus, their movements slow enough to feel almost stationary. Light filtered downward at a slightly altered angle, touching the upper edges of walls and roofs before settling across the ground in broader, softer bands. Surfaces responded gradually, stone warming, wood releasing faint, dry scents that blended into the air without distinction. Along interior passages and sheltered walkways, cooler shadows remained intact, preserving pockets of stillness that changed only when the light reached them later. and even then without urgency. Objects left in place showed no sign of interruption. Tools resting against walls. Containers aligned where they had last been set. Their presence marking continuity other than activity. The air itself felt layered, cooler near the ground, warmer higher up, creating gentle variations that shifted slowly as the hours progressed. Sounds remained sparse and distant, arriving softened, then fading before they could settle into memory. When movement occurred, it passed through quietly, footsteps absorbed by worn surfaces, fabric brushing lightly against air before returning to rest. In open spaces, the ground held faint impressions of prior use, not fresh, but accumulated, shaped over long periods rather than recent moments. Vegetation responded patiently to the conditions around it, leaves adjusting their angle almost imperceptibly, stems remaining steady, rooted in place. Water, where it flowed, maintained a consistent pace, neither accelerating nor slowing, tracing familiar paths that had changed very little over time. Reflections along its surface shifted gently, light and shadow rearranging themselves without altering the overall pattern. The environment seemed to regulate itself through repetition, small adjustments reinforcing stability rather than disrupting it. As the day continued, no clear markers separated one hour from the next, only the gradual redistribution of light and shade, warmth and coolness. Awareness could linger on any detail without needing to move on, and when it did drift elsewhere, nothing was lost. The surroundings remained available, unchanged in intention, holding their quiet balance as time extended forward, unannounced and unresolved. As those days extended in their familiar sequence, the environment continued to present itself without emphasis. Light settled more evenly now, spreading across open areas and enclosed spaces alike, softening contrasts rather than sharpening them. Walls carried a uniform warmth, while shaded sections remained cool and consistent, creating a quiet balance that held steady across long intervals. In those years, the passage of time expressed itself through accumulation rather than change, through the way surfaces gradually adapted to repeated exposure. Stone steps showed smoothness where countless crossings had occurred, not recently, but over stretches of time that blended together without distinction. Along interior rooms and sheltered corridors, air remained still for long periods, disturbed only occasionally by a slow current that moved through and then dissolved. Objects arranged for daily use retained their positions, bowls nested together, tools aligned with habit rather than intention, their order suggesting continuity more than activity. The sound of water continued at a measured pace, not loud enough to draw attention, yet constant enough to remain present beneath everything else. Outside, vegetation held its form, leaves neither fully still nor actively moving, resting in a state of readiness that required no effort. Shadows adjusted incrementally, retreating from one surface while extending across another. Changes so gradual they were felt only when noticed afterward. When people passed through these spaces, their presence blended seamlessly into the surroundings. Footsteps softened, gestures reduced to their simplest form. Once they moved on, the environment resumed its prior arrangement without correction or pause. The air carried faint traces of earlier activity, not distinct enough to identify, but present enough to suggest ongoing use. Timepieces, where they existed, marked progression mechanically, though the spaces themselves seemed indifferent to such measurement. Hours layered quietly, one over another, without separation. In that continuity, nothing hinted at urgency or destination. The surroundings remained receptive, holding each small variation without reacting to it. Awareness could remain suspended within these details, moving slowly from surface to surface, sound to silence, without encountering a boundary. The day did not advance so much as it persisted, maintaining its calm structure while allowing subtle adjustments to settle naturally, leaving everything open, ongoing, and without indication of resolution. As time continued along its familiar course, the spaces within the city retained their steady character, shaped more by repetition than by any distinct moment. Light, now softened by its gradual movement, rested across floors and open ground in wide, even fields, leaving edges and corners gently muted. In those hours, nothing appeared new, yet nothing felt absent. Surfaces carried the quiet evidence of long use, tables worn smooth at their edges, door frames polished slightly where hands had passed over them again and again. Air circulated slowly, barely noticeable, carrying with it a blend of scents that had settled into the environment over extended periods: wood, stone, fabric, and the faint trace of water nearby. In shaded areas, coolness remained consistent, while warmer pockets formed where light lingered longer, creating subtle variations that shifted without announcement. Objects continued to occupy their places without adjustment, cups aligned on shelves, baskets resting against walls, their arrangement suggesting familiarity rather than preparation. Outside, pathways stretched onward without emphasis, their surfaces marked by gradual smoothing rather than recent disturbance. Vegetation followed its own quiet cycle, leaves holding steady, stems flexing only when the air required it, growth unfolding slowly to be observed directly. Sounds arrived sporadically, distant and softened, never close enough to define their source, never sharp enough to interrupt stillness. When footsteps echoed briefly, they dissolved quickly, absorbed by space and material. Water reflected the sky in subdued tones, its movement steady and unremarkable, repeating patterns that required no attention to continue. The balance between activity and rest remained unchanged, allowing moments to blend into one another without separation. As the hours extended, shadows lengthened almost imperceptibly, lines shifting across surfaces, so gradually they seemed fixed until noticed later. Nothing indicated transition or progression beyond these small adjustments. The environment remained self-contained, holding its form without resistance, accommodating presence without responding to it. Awareness could settle anywhere within this continuity, lingering on texture, temperature, or sound, then drifting onward without loss. Time did not announce itself, and the surroundings offered no signal of completion, only the ongoing presence of routine, unfolding quietly, sustained by habit and repetition, and remaining open as it continued forward. In those continuing intervals, the environment maintained its calm alignment, each element remaining in quiet relation to the others. Light shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to soften previously bright surfaces and allow new areas to warm gradually. The change moved across the space like a slow breath, barely registered unless observed for a long time. Walls absorbed the light evenly, their textures becoming more apparent as shadows, thinned and redistributed themselves along corners and recesses. The ground retained warmth from earlier hours, releasing it steadily, creating a gentle consistency underfoot. Air lingered with minimal movement, layered rather than flowing, holding faint traces of dust and scent that had settled naturally over time. Objects continued to rest where they had been placed, their stillness unremarkable, their presence expected, A chair remained angled toward an opening. A container sat partially filled, neither adjusted nor neglected, simply present, outside. The rhythm of the surroundings persisted without emphasis. Pathways curved and extended, their edges softened by long use, their surfaces reflecting light and evenly in ways that had become familiar. Vegetation held steady, leaves catching light briefly before returning to shade, stems unmoved, unless prompted by a passing current of air. Sound remained distant and sparse, a low layer beneath awareness rather than a point of focus. When it appeared, it faded naturally, leaving behind the same quiet field it had crossed. Water continued along its course, its surface shifting subtly as reflections adjusted, never breaking its steady pace. The environment appeared to regulate itself through balance rather than action, allowing minor variations to settle without response. As the hours continued to unfold, no clear boundary marked their passage. The scene remained open, receptive, and unchanged in intention. Awareness could move slowly across surfaces and spaces, noting small differences without attaching meaning to them. Nothing suggested anticipation or closure. The surroundings simply continued, holding their arrangement as time extended forward, uninterrupted, allowing each moment to blend seamlessly into the next, maintaining a steady presence without signaling what might follow. As those periods carried on without interruption, the surroundings began to feel increasingly settled, as if each element had found a stable position within the broader arrangement. Light no longer shifted as noticeably, lingering longer on familiar surfaces, resting against walls and across open ground with a softened intensity. The contrast between brightness and shade diminished slightly, creating a more even field of perception that required little adjustment from moment to moment. In those hours, movement became less frequent, and when it did occur, it unfolded slowly, blending into the existing rhythm rather than standing apart from it. Air remained calm, holding temperature steadily, its subtle layers unchanged for extended stretches. Objects continued to mark routine through their placement alone. Vessels near entrances, folded materials resting where they had last been used, their presence suggesting continuity without expectation. Pathways appeared undisturbed, their surfaces holding the accumulated imprint of time rather than any recent passage. Vegetation showed minimal response to the day's progression, leaves resting in balanced positions, shadows beneath them deepening only slightly as light settled elsewhere. Sound thinned further, becoming more diffuse, its origins difficult to locate, its duration brief enough to dissolve before it could be followed. Water maintained its gentle course, reflecting less variation as light stabilized, its surface repeating familiar patterns without alteration. The environment absorbed each small change easily, incorporating it without disruption. As the hours extended, awareness encountered fewer points of distinction, fewer signals to move attention from one detail to another. Surfaces felt consistent, temperatures even, and space itself seemed to hold a quiet equilibrium. Nothing suggested departure or arrival. Time continued through quiet accumulation, marked only by the gradual settling of light and the deepening familiarity of the surroundings. The scene remained open and unfinalized, holding its steady form while allowing awareness to drift without direction, resting within the ongoing continuity as it extended forward without announcing what would come next. As the day continued to unfold in its slow, unassuming rhythm, the surroundings held a quiet persistence that seemed almost effortless. Light shifted gently across rooftops, and open spaces, softening where it lingered and sliding slowly into corners and recesses where shadow had been long established. Surfaces adjusted to these small variations without disruption, stone warming subtly in the sun, wood releasing faint, dry scents that blended seamlessly with the air. Pathways stretched outward, their edges smoothened by long familiarity rather than recent passage, guiding movements without demanding attention. Objects remained in place, each one holding the trace of prior use, bowls resting in their accustomed spots, benches aligned against walls, tools positioned where habit had placed them, their presence unremarkable yet steady. Vegetation along edges and courtyards held itself with gentle patience, leaves adjusting only when moved by the slowest currents of air, stems standing rooted without tension. Water reflected the sky with minimal variation, flowing evenly along its path, its surface capturing light and shadow in subtle, repetitive patterns that required no focus to persist. Sounds arrived at long intervals, softened by distance and space, fading almost immediately, leaving the area to return to its quiet consistency. Even human presence, when it appeared, blended naturally into the surroundings, leaving no disturbance, no abrupt mark, only a soft trace that quickly dissolved into the ongoing calm. Air retained its layered stillness, temperature shifting imperceptibly, carrying faint traces of earth, wood and water, all blending into a consistent atmosphere. Shadows extended and withdrew slowly, light redistributed, in such gentle increments that the passage of hours was felt more than seen. In this continuity, the environment remained receptive, holding its form without insistence, allowing awareness to move freely across surfaces and spaces. Nothing demanded interpretation, nothing suggested urgency, and the progression of time was marked only by subtle, patient change. Each element maintained its presence as part of a quiet, ongoing balance, leaving the scene open, unresolving, and uninterrupted. A calm structure that could persist indefinitely, without signaling conclusion or departure. As the hours stretched quietly onward, the environment began to settle into a softer, more expansive rhythm, where the details of routine appeared even less urgent and movement became almost optional. Light lingered longer across familiar surfaces, diffusing evenly through open spaces and across walls, brushing rooftops and pathways without emphasis. Stone and wood absorbed these subtle changes patiently, releasing warmth or scent in gentle increments that could be noticed only with sustained attention. Pathways remained clear, their surfaces marked by accumulated use rather than recent passage, edges rounded by countless slow footsteps that had long since become indistinct. Objects continued in quiet alignment, cups placed near windows, folded fabrics resting on low benches, small containers balanced along walls, each one maintaining its presence without calling for engagement. Vegetation responded with the softest of movements, leaves adjusting imperceptibly in the occasional waft of air, stems bending only enough to accommodate slight shifts without leaving their rooted positions. Water mirrored the sky in muted, consistent tones, flowing along its channel in a steady, unremarkable manner, reflecting light and shadow with minimal variation. Sounds became even more diffuse, distant and softened, arriving intermittently and fading before attention could fully settle on them. Human presence, when it appeared, was fleeting and absorbed immediately into the environment, leaving no abrupt mark, only the gentle trace of motion that dissolved as quietly as it had arrived. Shadows shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, and the balance between light and shade extended without clear boundaries. Time moved without insistence, layered gently across surfaces, space, and air, carrying a sense of continuity other than direction. Awareness could wander slowly from one observation to another, lingering on textures, temperature, or quiet sounds, without encountering tension or resolution. In these moments, the environment seemed to hold itself in patient equilibrium, embracing subtle change while maintaining the same open, uninterrupted quality, preparing naturally for the next periods of stillness and quiet emotion that would follow, and leaving no indication of what lay beyond the ongoing calm. As the day continued its unhurried progression, the environment settled into a deeper quiet, where movement became sparse and time itself seemed to stretch almost imperceptibly. Light held a soft consistency, spreading across open areas and walls without contrast or interruption, brushing gently along stone surfaces and wooden edges alike. Shadows extended and withdrew slowly, so gradual that their passage was more felt than seen, tracing familiar lines without drawing attention. Objects remained where they had long rested, cups aligned on shelves, cloth folded and layered with care, small containers balanced in corners, each holding its place without necessity or expectation. Pathways, smoothed by repeated but gentle passage, stretched outward without prominence, their edges blending into surrounding textures of stone, soil, and plant life. Vegetation moved subtly in response to occasional air currents, leaves shifting slowly, stems bending lightly, the natural rhythm harmonizing with the larger stillness of the space. Water reflected the quiet sky above, its surface shifting only slightly, repeating gentle patterns that required no focus to persist, carrying the same reflective tone across its course. Sounds, now even more diffuse, appeared and faded before they could be clearly identified, distant echoes merging into the general calm. Human presence, when it occurred, left no interruption, only the soft imprint of motion that dissolved quickly into the surrounding equilibrium. The air itself remained layered yet unmoving, carrying faint traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, blending with the subtle scents of stone, wood, and foliage. Time seemed to pass without insistence, measured not by events, but by the ongoing adjustments of light, temperature, and shadow. Awareness could drift from one detail to another, lingering on surface, texture, or sound without demanding resolution. The scene persisted in its quiet continuity, open and unrevealing, holding each element in patient equilibrium. In this sustained calm, nothing concluded, nothing pressed forward, and the environment extended seamlessly, preparing for the softer, slower shifts that would emerge naturally in the next phase, where presence would fade further, and the gradual decline of motion would begin almost unnoticed, allowing the mind and space to move together into gentler, quieter rhythms. As time continued beyond those familiar patterns, the environment began to reflect changes that were not immediately apparent. Light still moved across surfaces, as it always had, but it lingered longer in some areas, leaving others untouched for extended periods. Walls and pathways retained their form, though subtle variations appeared in their texture, small irregularities settling in gradually rather than arriving all at once. Objects remained in place, yet some showed signs of prolonged stillness, layers of dust collecting evenly, edges no longer disturbed as often as before. In those years, routines did not disappear. They simply loosened, stretching over longer intervals, leaving wider gaps between moments of use. Water continued to flow along its channels, steady and unbroken, though reflections grew slightly duller as fewer movements altered the surface. Vegetation adjusted without resistance, growth patterns slowing almost imperceptibly, leaves holding their positions longer, stems thickening where they had remained undisturbed. Sound thinned further, not because it ceased, but because fewer sources contributed to it, leaving longer spans of quiet between softened echoes. When footsteps occurred, they felt less frequent, absorbed quickly into space, leaving behind no immediate trace. Light fixtures, markers, and boundaries remained intact, though their presence felt less central, less relied upon, as if the environment had begun to operate with reduced attention. Air held a more settled quality, carrying familiar scents that lingered longer before dispersing, suggesting fewer disturbances to shift them along. The balance between maintenance and neglect shifted gradually, not enough to draw notice, but enough to allow small changes to accumulate. Nothing indicated a clear transition, and nothing suggested loss. The surroundings continued to function, though at a slower, more diffuse pace, with systems remaining in place while their use became less consistent. Awareness could pass over these details without naming them, sensing only that time now moved with fewer interruptions, allowing spaces to remain unchanged for longer stretches, quietly adjusting as the extended drift continued forward without announcement or resolution. As the years extended quietly, the spaces continued to operate with the same outward structure, though their internal rhythm softened further. Light still traced familiar paths across walls and open ground, yet it encountered fewer interruptions, spreading more evenly where movement had once broken its flow. Surfaces held longer periods of stillness, allowing fine layers of dust and residue to settle without disturbance, smoothing differences rather than highlighting them. Objects remained functional, though their use became less regular. Containers left untouched for longer stretches, tools resting where they had last been placed, their edges no longer polished by frequent contact. Water followed its established routes, steady and reliable, though its surface reflected fewer variations, responding less often to passing motion. Vegetation adjusted gradually, growth continuing at a restrained pace, leaves remaining intact longer before shifting, branches holding their shape without frequent interference. Sound became increasingly intermittent, arriving in softened fragments, separated by longer spans of quiet, making the spaces between noises more noticeable than the sounds themselves. Pathways remained intact, their outlines clear, yet impressions accumulated slowly, shaped by infrequent passage rather than daily use. Air circulated gently, though its movement felt delayed, carrying familiar scents that lingered longer before dispersing, suggesting fewer disturbances to redirect them. Structures required little immediate attention, standing as they had for extended periods, their stability reinforced by the absence of strain rather than active upkeep. The environment began to favor persistence over adjustment, allowing minor irregularities to remain instead of being corrected. Time continued without markers, measured less by activity and more by the duration of stillness between moments of change. Awareness could move through these spaces without encountering urgency, noticing that processes still functioned, though with reduced frequency and extended pauses. Nothing appeared broken, and nothing demanded repair. Instead, the surroundings adopted a quieter pace, sustaining themselves through continuity rather than renewal, holding their form while gradually allowing longer intervals of rest. As the drift continued onward, subtle and uninterrupted, without signaling where it might eventually lead. As time carried forward through these extended intervals, the environment showed signs of operating with reduced input, though its outward appearance remained largely unchanged. Light continued to arrive and settle across familiar surfaces, but its movement felt slower, lingering longer where it landed, leaving other areas untouched for greater spans of time. Floors and walls retained their structure, yet subtle inconsistencies became more apparent, small accumulations that were neither corrected nor disruptive, simply allowed to remain. Objects rested undisturbed for longer periods, their placement no longer reinforced by frequent use, edges softening as contact became less common. Water maintained its steady passage, flowing as it always had, though the surface reflected fewer disturbances, its patterns repeating with greater uniformity. Vegetation persisted quietly, growth unfolding at a restrained pace, leaves holding their positions longer, branches remaining untrimmed, adapting naturally to the available conditions. Sound diminished further, not disappearing, but spacing itself out, arriving occasionally and fading quickly, leaving behind longer stretches of quiet that felt settled rather than empty. Pathways continued to define movement through the area, though they received less attention, their surfaces shaped by infrequent passage rather than constant use. Air remained still for extended moments, carrying familiar scents that lingered without being displaced, suggesting fewer interactions to stir them. Structures stood without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, requiring little immediate response as small changes accumulated gradually. Maintenance became less deliberate, not through neglect, but through extended intervals between action, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Time moved forward without emphasis, marked by duration other than events. Awareness could pass through these surroundings without encountering interruption, sensing that systems remained in place while operating more quietly, more slowly. Nothing indicated a turning point, and nothing suggested absence. Instead, the environment continued to ease into longer pauses, sustaining itself through repetition and inertia, allowing stillness to expand naturally between moments of motion. As the drift extended onward, subtle and continuous, without direction or conclusion. As the passage of time continued to widen, the environment settled further into extended intervals of quiet operation. Light still followed its familiar progression across surfaces, though its movement felt less defined, spreading gently and remaining in place longer before shifting again. Walls and floors held their shape, yet small variations became part of the overall texture. Subtle irregularities no longer smoothed out by frequent interaction. Objects remained where they had been last positioned, not forgotten, but simply left to rest, their presence integrated into the space without expectation of immediate use. Water continued along established paths, its flow consistent, though its surface reflected fewer changes, responding only to the most gradual adjustments in light and air. Vegetation maintained its steady presence, growth unfolding slowly, leaves holding their form longer, branches remaining undisturbed as natural processes continued without guidance. Sound thinned again, not through silence, but through spacing, with longer pauses between softened echoes, allowing quiet to become the dominant layer. Pathways remained visible and intact, though their surfaces recorded fewer impressions, shaped now by infrequent movement rather than constant passage. Air lingered in place, circulating gently when prompted, carrying familiar scents that persisted longer before dispersing. Structures continued to stand without modification, supported by their existing balance. requiring no immediate attention. As small changes accumulated evenly, the environment began to favor duration over renewal, allowing processes to extend without interruption. Time became less associated with activity and more with sustained stillness, measured by how long conditions remained unchanged. Awareness could move through these spaces without encountering urgency or disruption, noticing that systems remained present while functioning with reduced frequency. Nothing appeared abandoned, and nothing suggested failure. Instead, the surroundings continued to operate quietly, maintaining form, while allowing longer stretches of rest between moments of adjustment, as the gradual drift carried everything forward, unobtrusive and ongoing, without indicating what might follow. As those long intervals continued to settle into place, the surroundings maintained their outward coherence while operating with even fewer interruptions. Light remained present across familiar surfaces, though it appeared less directed, spreading gently and lingering without emphasis. Areas that once shifted frequently between brightness and shade now held their state longer, allowing contrast to soften into a more even field. Walls, floors, and fixtures retained their structure, yet fine details accumulated quietly. Thin layers of residue, faint discolorations, small changes that did not require attention and therefore remained. Objects continued to occupy their positions, containers left unopened, tools resting undisturbed, their usefulness unchanged, though their engagement became increasingly rare. Water flowed as it always had, steady and reliable, its surface reflecting the same muted patterns repeatedly, altered only by the slow movement of light overhead. Vegetation persisted without guidance, growth unfolding gradually, leaves remaining intact longer before adjusting, branches extending naturally into available space. Sound became more distant in character, arriving less often and dissolving more quickly, leaving extended spans of quiet that felt stable rather than empty. Pathways remained clear and navigable, though their surfaces showed fewer recent marks, shaped now by occasional passage rather than regular movement. Air settled into longer periods of stillness, circulating only when prompted by gradual temperature shifts, carrying familiar scents that lingered without being displaced. Structures stood without modification, supported by their existing balance, requiring no immediate response, as small variations accumulated evenly over time. Maintenance shifted into the background, not removed, but delayed, allowing systems to continue without frequent adjustment. Time passed through duration rather than sequence, marked by how long conditions remained unchanged. Awareness could move gently through these spaces, noticing continuity more than difference, sensing that everything still functioned, though at a quieter pace. Nothing signaled interruption or decline. The environment simply continued, extending its intervals of rest and reduced motion, allowing the drift to deepen naturally, unobtrusive and unresolved, as it carried forward without announcing its direction. As the passage of time lengthened further, the environment began to feel increasingly self-contained, sustaining itself with minimal interaction. Light continued its slow movement across surfaces, though its shifts appeared softer, remaining in place longer before transitioning elsewhere. Areas once marked by frequent adjustment now held a steady tone, allowing brightness and shade to blend into a consistent balance. Walls and floors showed quiet signs of extended stillness, faint accumulations settling evenly, textures becoming more uniform as the variation smoothed itself out over time. Objects remained available but largely untouched, containers closed, tools resting in familiar positions, their presence unchanged even as engagement grew less frequent. Water maintained its steady course, flowing without interruption, its surface reflecting light in repetitive, muted patterns that rarely altered. Vegetation persisted calmly, growth unfolding without guidance, leaves holding their form longer, branches extending naturally into surrounding space. Sound continued to thin, not disappearing, but spacing itself out further, arriving occasionally and fading quickly, leaving quiet as the prevailing condition. Pathways remained open and intact, though their surfaces recorded fewer recent impressions, shaped now by infrequent passage rather than daily movement. Air circulated gently at long intervals, carrying familiar scents that lingered without being redirected, contributing to the sense of extended pause. Structures stood as they had for long periods, requiring little immediate attention, their stability maintained through balance rather than adjustment. Processes once addressed routinely now occurred less often, allowing small variations to remain uncorrected without consequence. Time progressed through accumulation rather than change, measured by the persistence of conditions rather than by events. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering urgency, sensing that systems continued quietly, operating with reduced frequency and longer pauses between motion. Nothing appeared broken or absent. Instead, the surroundings sustained their form through continuity, allowing stillness to expand gently between moments of activity. As the ongoing drift settled deeper, unremarked and unresolving, extending forward without clear indication of what might follow. As those extended periods continued to lay themselves quietly, the surroundings appeared increasingly settled into long-standing patterns that required little attention. Light remained present across walls and open ground, though its movement slowed further, lingering where it fell and leaving other areas unchanged for extended spans. Surfaces held their accumulated textures without alteration, fine traces of time remaining evenly distributed, neither emphasized nor corrected. Objects continued to rest in familiar arrangements, available yet seldom engaged, their positions reinforcing continuity rather than use. Containers stayed closed for longer intervals. Tools remained aligned where they had last been placed, their presence steady and unobtrusive. Water followed its established routes without variation, flowing evenly, its surface reflecting light in subdued, repeating forms that changed only gradually. Vegetation maintained its quiet persistence, growth continuing at a restrained pace, leaves remaining intact longer, branches extending naturally where space allowed, unaffected by frequent adjustments. Sound thinned again, becoming less distinguishable, arriving as softened, impressions separated by long stretches of quiet that felt settled, rather than empty. Pathways remained clearly defined, though their surfaces showed fewer signs of recent passage, shaped now by occasional movement rather than regular travel. Air lingered with minimal circulation, temperature holding steady for long intervals, familiar scents remaining suspended without dispersing quickly. Structures stood without modification, supported by their existing balance, small variations accumulating evenly without drawing notice. Processes that once occurred regularly now unfolded less often, not removed, but spaced farther apart, allowing conditions to persist unchanged. Time moved forward through duration rather than progression, measured by how long the environment remained consistent. Awareness could move gently across these spaces, encountering continuity instead of difference, sensing that everything remained in place while functioning more quietly. Nothing suggested interruption or resolution. The surroundings simply continued, extending their intervals of stillness and reduce motion, allowing the drift to deepen further. Gradual and unobtrusive, carrying everything onward without signaling where it might eventually lead. As time moved on through these quieter stretches, the environment continued to settle into patterns that no longer required frequent renewal. Light remained steady across most surfaces, shifting only slightly as the hours passed, its movement so gradual that it blended into the background of perception. Areas once marked by regular variation now held their state longer, brightness and shade merging into a softer, more uniform balance. Walls and floors retained their structure, while small accumulations remained undisturbed. Thin layers settling evenly without drawing attention. Objects stayed arranged as they had been, accessible but seldom engaged, their positions suggesting continuity rather than readiness. Containers rested unopened, fabrics remained folded, and tools lay where they had last been used, unchanged by the passage of many intervals. Water continued along its familiar paths, its flow consistent and unbroken, reflecting muted tones that repeated with little variation. Vegetation persisted quietly, growth unfolding at a measured pace, leaves holding their form longer, branches extending naturally where space allowed, guided only by light and gravity. Sound grew increasingly sparse, arriving less often and fading more quickly, leaving longer spans where quiet remained uninterrupted. Pathways stayed visible and intact, though their surfaces recorded fewer recent impressions, shaped now by occasional movement rather than habitual passage. Air lingered in place for extended moments, circulating gently only when prompted by gradual shifts in temperature, carrying familiar scents that remained suspended longer than before. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, requiring little immediate response as minor variations accumulated evenly over time. Processes once maintained through regular attention are unfolded less frequently, not absent, but extended, allowing conditions to persist without intervention. Time progressed through duration rather than sequence, marked by how long the surroundings remained unchanged. Awareness could move slowly through these spaces, encountering consistency instead of contrast, sensing that everything still functioned, though with reduced motion and longer pauses. Nothing indicated disruption or conclusion. The environment simply continued to ease into deeper stillness, sustaining itself through repetition and inertia, as the gradual drift carried on quietly, unannounced and unresolved. As the extended passage of time continued to settle over the surroundings, the environment appeared increasingly comfortable with long periods of minimal change. Light remained present without emphasis, resting across surfaces in broad, even layers, shifting so slowly that its movement blended into stillness. Areas that once reflected subtle variation now held their tone longer, allowing contrasts to soften and remain unresolved. Walls and floors kept their familiar form, while fine traces accumulated gently, thin deposits and softened textures becoming part of the overall surface rather than standing apart. Objects stayed arranged as before, accessible yet rarely disturbed, their positions reinforcing habits without prompting action. Containers remained closed for extended spans. Fabrics held their folds, tools rested where they had last been placed, unchanged by the quiet passage of many intervals. Water continued its steady course along established channels, its flow unbroken, reflecting muted light in repetitive patterns that varied only gradually. Vegetation persisted calmly, growth unfolding at a restrained pace, leaves holding their positions longer, branches extending naturally into available space Without redirection, sound became increasingly infrequent, arriving as distant impressions that faded almost immediately, leaving quiet to settle back in without interruption. Pathways remained clear and intact, though their surfaces recorded few recent impressions, shaped now by occasional movement rather than regular passage. Air lingered with minimal circulation, temperature remaining stable for long stretches. Familiar scents suspended gently without dispersing quickly. Structures continued to stand without modification, supported by balance rather than adjustment, allowing small variations to remain without consequence. Processes that once occurred routinely now unfolded at wider intervals, not absent, but extended, allowing conditions to persist unchanged. Time moved forward through duration rather than progression, marked by how long the surroundings remained consistent. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering urgency, sensing that systems still functioned, though more quietly, with longer pauses between motion. Nothing suggested interruption or resolution. The environment simply continued, allowing stillness to deepen and intervals to widen, as the gradual drift carried everything onward, subtle and ongoing, without signaling what might come next. As the hours extended further into quiet repetition, the surroundings settled more fully into long intervals of gentle persistence. Light moved across walls, floors, and open spaces with minimal change, softening contrasts and leaving surfaces evenly illuminated for extended periods. Areas once subject to frequent adjustment now held their state longer, brightness and shadow blending into a calm, steady balance. Walls and pathways maintained their structure, though subtle traces of accumulated stillness appeared. Fine dust, softened textures, and minor unevenness that did not demand attention. Objects rested undisturbed, positioned where habit had left them, available but rarely used, containers closed, fabrics folded, and tools lying in their accustomed places. Water continued along familiar channels, its flow unbroken, reflecting muted patterns that shifted only gradually. With the movement of light and air, vegetation persisted quietly, leaves remaining in place for longer intervals, stems and branches extending naturally into surrounding space, their adjustments occurring only slowly and subtly. Sounds arrived infrequently, soft and distant, fading quickly into longer spans of quiet that dominated the environment. Pathways remained clearly defined, though their surfaces bore fewer recent impressions, shaped now by occasional travel rather than continual use. Air circulated at long intervals, carrying faint traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, remaining suspended longer than before without disturbance. Structures stood without immediate modification, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Systems and processes that had once been maintained more actively now operated with reduced frequency, sustained by inertia and repetition rather than deliberate attention. Time passed through the continuation of stillness rather than by marked events, measured in long stretches of unaltered conditions. Awareness could move gently through the space, observing continuity rather than change, noticing that everything continued to function quietly, though at a slower, more diffuse pace. Nothing signaled conclusion or interruption. The environment simply extended its intervals of calm and minimal motion, sustaining itself naturally, carrying the subtle, unbroken drift onward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing, without indicating what might follow in the gradual progression of time. As the passage of time extended further, the surroundings retained their structure while operating with increasingly infrequent adjustments. Light continued to fall gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering in place longer and softening contrasts between shadow and illumination. Areas that had once experienced regular variation now maintain their state, allowing subtle differences to blend naturally into the environment. Walls, pathways, and floors held their form steadily, though thin layers of dust, faint textures, and minor irregularities quietly accumulated without intervention. Objects rested undisturbed, positioned according to prior use, yet increasingly untouched. Containers remaining closed, fabrics folded, tools lying in their accustomed places, all reinforcing continuity rather than activity. Water flowed steadily along familiar channels, reflecting light immuted, repeating patterns that changed only gradually with the movement of the day. Vegetation persisted without haste, leaves and branches holding their positions for longer intervals, growth continuing slowly, adapting naturally to the surrounding conditions. Sounds became more diffuse, arriving at longer intervals and fading quickly, leaving extended spaces of quiet to dominate the environment. Pathways remained clearly defined, though impressions recorded fewer recent interactions, shaped now by infrequent passage other than constant movement. Air circulated gently at extended intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering longer before dispersing. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, relying on their existing balance, allowing minor variations to remain uncorrected without consequence. Processes that had once required routine attention unfolded with less frequency, sustained by inertia and repetition rather than deliberate action. Time passed through extended stillness rather than events, measured in the persistence of unchanged conditions. Awareness could move slowly through these spaces, noting continuity instead of contrast, sensing that systems remained functional though operating more quietly, and with longer pauses. Nothing suggested interruption or conclusion. The environment simply continued, deepening the intervals of rest and quiet motion, carrying forward the subtle, unbroken drift without announcement, ongoing and unresolved, allowing time and space to extend naturally into the next cycles of change. As time extended further into these quiet intervals, the environment persisted with minimal disturbance, maintaining its outward form while internal rhythms softened. Light continued to move gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering longer in some areas, retreating more slowly from others, creating a subtle evenness that blended into the background. Surfaces accumulated minor layers of dust and natural wear, thin traces that were neither removed nor disruptive, integrating into the overall texture without drawing notice. Objects remained in their familiar positions, available but seldom used, containers closed, fabrics folded, and tools resting where habit had left them, their presence reinforcing continuity more than action. Water flowed steadily along familiar channels, its surface reflecting light immuted, repeating patterns, altered only gradually by slow currents and shifts of air. Vegetation adapted naturally, growth unfolding with measured pace, leaves holding position longer, stems and branches extending quietly into available space. Sounds grew even more diffuse, arriving at extended intervals and fading quickly, leaving stretches of calm that dominated perception rather than being, interrupted by momentary noise. Pathways stayed intact and clearly defined, though fewer impressions appeared from recent movement, their surfaces shaped now by occasional travel other than daily passage. Air circulated gently, prolonged intervals, carrying familiar scents that lingered longer, remaining suspended in still layers, rather than being dispersed immediately. Structures continued to stand with stability, relying on their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without attention. Processes that had once been maintained frequently now unfolded with reduced regularity, not absent, but spaced across longer intervals, letting conditions remain largely unchanged. Time passed through extended stillness, measured by duration rather than events, marked by how long the environment retained its state. Awareness could drift slowly through the spaces, observing continuity rather than difference, sensing that systems remained functional though operating more quietly and at a gentler pace. Nothing indicated interruption, urgency, or resolution. The environment simply continued, sustaining extended intervals of rest and minimal activity, allowing the subtle drift to progress further, unobtrusive and ongoing, without signaling what might come next. As the quiet passage of time extended further, the surroundings appeared increasingly attuned to long periods of minimal change. Light continued to move across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering in some areas and retreating slowly from others, creating an even, muted presence. Surfaces accumulated faint layers of dust and subtle texture, forming a gentle patina over time that required no intervention. Integrating naturally into the environment, objects remained in place, accessible yet largely untouched, containers closed, fabrics folded, and tools lying where they had last been used, maintaining a sense of order without active engagement. Water followed its familiar paths steadily, its surface reflecting light in subdued, repeating patterns, disturbed only by gradual movements of air or shifts in illumination. Vegetation persisted quietly, leaves holding position longer, stems and branches extending naturally, growth unfolding slowly according to the available conditions. Sounds thinned further, arriving occasionally and dissolving quickly, leaving extended spans of quiet to dominate perception, becoming the underlying rhythm of the space rather than punctuating it. Pathways stayed visible and intact, though impressions from recent movement were rare, shaped now by infrequent passage rather than habitual travel. Air circulated gently at long intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering without immediate dispersal, contributing to the calm continuity. Structures remained balanced and steady, supported by their existing form, allowing minor variations to persist without disruption. Processes that had once been routinely maintained now unfolded more slowly, sustained by repetition and inertia rather than deliberate attention. Time passed through extended stillness rather than events, measured by how long the surroundings retained their condition. Awareness could drift across these spaces without encountering urgency or contrast, sensing that systems continued quietly and with longer intervals between action. Nothing suggested interruption or conclusion. The environment simply extended, carrying forward the subtle, unbroken drift, deepening intervals of rest and minimal activity, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing. As the gentle progression continued without signaling what might follow. As the quiet progression of time continued, the environment maintained its gentle, unchanging rhythm, operating with minimal disturbance while retaining outward structure. Light moved slowly across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering in some areas longer, retreating gradually from others, blending into a muted, even presence. Surfaces held faint traces of accumulated stillness, subtle textures and thin layers of dust integrating naturally into the surroundings. unremarkable, and unobtrusive. Objects remained positioned according to prior use, available but seldom touched, containers closed, fabrics folded, and tools resting where they had last been placed, reinforcing continuity more than activity. Water flowed steadily along familiar paths, its surface reflecting soft patterns that shifted only gradually, responding to minimal changes in light or air. Vegetation persisted quietly, leaves holding position longer, branches extending naturally where space allowed, growth unfolding slowly and without guidance. Sounds became increasingly infrequent, soft and distant, fading quickly into extended periods of calm that dominated perception. Pathways remained intact and navigable, though surfaces bore few recent impressions, shaped now by occasional passage, other than daily movement. Air circulated gently, with long intervals of stillness, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering in place without immediate dispersal. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had once been maintained more actively now unfolded at wider intervals, not absent, but spaced farther apart, letting conditions persist unchanged. Time moved through stillness rather than events, measured in extended stretches where the surroundings retain their form. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, noticing continuity instead of difference, sensing that systems remained functional though operating at a quieter pace and with longer pauses. Nothing indicated interruption, urgency, or resolution. The environment simply continued, deepening intervals of rest and minimal activity, carrying the subtle, unbroken drift onward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing, allowing time and space to stretch naturally into the next cycles of subtle adjustment. As the slow passage of time extended further, the environment continued to operate with minimal disruption, its form intact while internal rhythms softened almost imperceptibly. Light traced familiar paths across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering longer where it fell, retreating gradually from shaded areas, creating a smooth, even presence that required little attention. Surfaces retained the subtle accumulation of stillness, thin layers of dust, gentle textures, and minor irregularities that integrated naturally into the surroundings. Without drawing notice, objects remained in their familiar positions, accessible yet seldom engaged, containers left closed, fabrics folded, and tools resting in their accustomed places, maintaining order without active use. Water flowed steadily along established channels, its surface reflecting subdued patterns that shifted only gradually with light and air. The movement calm and predictable. Vegetation persisted quietly, growth continuing at a slow, measured pace, leaves holding position longer, branches extending naturally into surrounding space, adapting to the conditions without interference. Sounds became more intermittent, soft and distant, fading quickly into longer stretches of quiet that dominated perception, establishing a persistent underlying rhythm. Pathways remained clearly defined, though their surfaces recorded few recent impressions, shaped now by occasional rather than regular passage. Air circulated gently at long intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, remaining suspended in still layers for extended periods. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes once maintained routinely now unfolded with reduced frequency, sustained by repetition and inertia rather than deliberate attention. Time moved forward through extended stillness, measured not by events, but by the duration of unchanged conditions. Awareness could move slowly through these spaces, observing continuity rather than difference, sensing that systems remained functional, though operating more quietly and with longer pauses between motion. Nothing suggested disruption, urgency, or resolution. The environment simply continued, deepening intervals of calm and minimal activity, allowing the subtle, unbroken drift to carry forward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing, as the gradual progression extended quietly into the next moments of change. As the quiet passage of hours and days stretched onward, the surroundings remained steady, sustaining their outward form, while internal rhythms softened and slowed further. Light continued to move gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering in some areas longer, while shifting gradually elsewhere, creating a calm, even presence that blended naturally into the environment. Surfaces accumulated subtle layers of dust and texture, fine traces that integrated seamlessly, unnoticed and unobtrusive, forming part of the ongoing stillness. Objects rested where they had been positioned, available but seldom engaged, containers closed, fabrics folded, tools lying in their accustomed places, maintaining order through quiet presence rather than activity. Water followed its familiar channels steadily, reflecting muted, repetitive patterns on its surface that shifted only gradually, responding to subtle changes in light and air. Vegetation persisted with quiet continuity, growth unfolding slowly, leaves holding position longer, branches extending naturally into surrounding space, shaped by environmental conditions rather than frequent interaction. Sounds became increasingly sparse, soft and distant, arriving only occasionally, before fading into long stretches of calm that dominated perception. Pathways remained intact and clearly defined, though their surfaces showed fewer recent impressions, shaped by infrequent passage rather than daily use. Air circulated at extended intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering longer before dispersal, reinforcing the overall sense of stillness. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had previously required regular attention now occurred with less frequency, maintained by repetition and inertia rather than deliberate intervention. Time passed not through events, but through the ongoing persistence of unchanged conditions, measured in stretches of stillness rather than marked changes. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, observing continuity rather than contrast, sensing that systems remained functional, operating more quietly and with longer intervals between action. Nothing indicated disruption or conclusion. The environment simply continued, deepening intervals of calm and minimal activity, sustaining the subtle, unbroken drift as it carried forward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing, extending naturally into the next periods of gradual adjustment. As the slow passage of time continued, the surroundings maintained their outward form, while internal rhythms softened, stretching the intervals of quiet into longer, uninterrupted periods. Light moved gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering longer in some areas, retreating gradually in others, blending into a consistent, even presence that required little attention. Surfaces held subtle traces of accumulation, thin layers of dust, softened textures, and minor irregularities that integrated naturally into the environment without drawing notice. Objects remained positioned according to prior use, accessible yet seldom engaged, containers left closed, fabrics folded, and tools resting in their accustomed places, preserving order through presence rather than action. Water followed familiar paths steadily, its flow uninterrupted, reflecting muted patterns that shifted only slowly, responding to the slightest adjustments of light and air. Vegetation persisted quietly, leaves holding their form for longer intervals, branches extending naturally into surrounding space, growth unfolding gradually without guidance. Sounds became increasingly sparse, soft and distant, arriving intermittently and fading quickly into longer spans of calm that dominated the environment. Pathways remained clear and navigable, though their surfaces recorded fewer recent impressions, shaped now by occasional movement rather than frequent passage. Air circulated gently, prolonged intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering without immediate dispersal, reinforcing the prevailing stillness. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had once been maintained routinely now unfolded with less frequency, sustained by inertia and repetition rather than deliberate action. Time moved forward through duration rather than sequence, marked by how long the surroundings retain their state. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, noticing continuity instead of contrast, sensing that systems remained functional though operating more quietly and with longer pauses between motion. Nothing suggested urgency, disruption, or conclusion. The environment simply continued, extending intervals of rest and minimal activity, carrying forward the subtle, unbroken drift, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing, as the gradual progression of stillness persisted naturally into the next. Moments of quiet adjustment. As the quiet progression of time extended further, the surroundings persisted with minimal disturbance, their form intact while internal activity slowed and softened. Light continued to move gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering in some areas and shifting gradually elsewhere, blending into a calm, even presence that became part of the background rather than a point of attention. Surfaces retained subtle traces of accumulation, thin layers of dust and gentle textures forming quietly over time, integrating naturally without requiring intervention. Objects remained where they had been placed, accessible but seldom engaged. Containers left closed, fabrics folded, and tools resting in familiar positions, maintaining order through presence rather than action. Water flowed steadily along familiar channels, its surface reflecting muted patterns that shifted only gradually with the light and air. Undisturbed and calm, vegetation persisted quietly, leaves holding position longer, branches extending naturally into surrounding space, growth unfolding slowly, adapting to the conditions without interference. Sounds became increasingly intermittent, soft and distant, arriving only occasionally before fading quickly, leaving longer spans where quiet prevailed and dominated perception. Pathways remained intact and clearly defined, though surfaces bore few recent impressions, shaped now by infrequent travel rather than habitual movement. Air circulated gently at long intervals, carrying traces of warmth, moisture, and earth that lingered in place, reinforcing the quiet continuity. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had once been maintained more actively now unfolded less frequently, sustained by inertia and repetition rather than deliberate attention. Time moved forward through extended stillness, measured by the persistence of unchanged conditions rather than events. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, observing continuity instead of contrast, sensing that systems remained functional though operating more quietly, and with longer pauses. Nothing suggested interruption, urgency, or resolution. The environment simply continued, sustaining long intervals of calm and minimal activity, allowing the subtle, unbroken drift to carry forward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing. As the gradual progression extended naturally into the next, cycles of quiet adjustment. As the passage of time stretched onward, the surroundings maintained their gentle, consistent rhythm, sustaining outward form, while internal processes slowed further into quiet intervals. Light moved softly across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering longer in some areas and shifting gradually in others, blending into a smooth, even presence that drew little attention. Surfaces held the subtle accumulation of stillness, thin layers of dust, faint textures, and minor irregularities, quietly integrating into the environment without requiring intervention. Objects remained positioned where habit had placed them, accessible yet seldom engaged, containers left closed, fabrics folded, and tools resting in their accustomed places, sustaining continuity through quiet presence rather than activity. Water continued along familiar channels steadily, reflecting muted, repeating patterns that shifted only gradually with light and air. Vegetation persisted calmly, leaves remaining in place for extended periods, branches extending naturally into surrounding space, growth unfolding slowly and without guidance. Sounds arrived occasionally, soft and distant, fading quickly into stretches of quiet that came to dominate perception, establishing a gentle, underlying rhythm. Pathways remained intact and clearly defined, though their surfaces bore few recent impressions, shaped now by infrequent movement rather than regular passage. Air circulated gently at prolonged intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth that lingered without immediate dispersal, reinforcing the sense of calm. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had once been maintained routinely now occurred less often, sustained by repetition and inertia rather than deliberate attention. Time passed not through events, but through the continuation of unchanged conditions, measured in the persistence of stillness rather than marked change. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, noting continuity rather than contrast, sensing that systems remained functional though operating more quietly and with longer pauses between movement. Nothing indicated disruption or conclusion. The environment simply continued, extending intervals of calm and minimal activity, carrying the subtle, unbroken drift forward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing. As the gradual progression of quiet persisted naturally into the next, moments of subtle adjustment. As the quiet passage of time continued to unfold, the surroundings remained steady, maintaining their form while internal rhythms slowed further into prolonged intervals of calm. Light moved gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering in some areas and retreating gradually in others, blending into an even, muted presence that required little attention. Surfaces retained subtle traces of accumulation, thin layers of dust, soft textures, and minor irregularities that integrated naturally into the environment without drawing notice. Objects remained positioned according to habit, accessible yet seldom engaged, containers closed, fabrics folded, tools resting in familiar places, reinforcing continuity more than activity. Water continued to flow steadily along established channels, reflecting subdued patterns that shifted only gradually with light and air. Vegetation persisted quietly, leaves holding their positions for longer intervals, branches extending naturally into surrounding space, growth unfolding slowly, adapting naturally to conditions without interference. Sounds became increasingly sparse, soft and distant, arriving intermittently and fading quickly into extended spans of quiet that dominated perception, creating a gentle, underlying rhythm. Pathways remained intact and clearly defined. Those surfaces bore few recent impressions, shaped now by occasional rather than habitual passage. Air circulated gently at prolonged intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering longer before dispersing, reinforcing the calm continuity. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had once been maintained, more actively now unfolded at reduced frequency, sustained by repetition and inertia rather than deliberate attention. Time passed not through events, but through the persistence of unchanged conditions, measured in long stretches of stillness rather than marked change. Awareness could move slowly through these spaces, observing continuity instead of contrast, sensing that systems remained functional though operating more quietly and with longer pauses between motion. Nothing suggested interruption, urgency, or conclusion. The environment simply continued, extending intervals of calm and minimal activity, carrying the subtle, unbroken drift forward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing, as the gradual progression extended naturally into the next. Cycles of quiet adjustment. As the quiet flow of time stretched further, the environment continued to operate with minimal interruption, sustaining its outward structure while internal processes slowed and softened. Light moved gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering in some areas and retreating gradually in others, blending into a smooth, even presence that remained unobtrusive. Surfaces retained subtle accumulations, thin layers of dust, softened textures, and minor irregularities quietly, integrating into the surroundings without drawing attention. Objects remained positioned where habit had placed them, accessible yet seldom engaged. Containers left closed, fabrics folded, and tools resting in familiar locations, maintaining continuity through presence rather than activity. Water flowed steadily along familiar channels, reflecting muted patterns that shifted only gradually. With the passage of light and air, vegetation persisted quietly, leaves holding their form for longer intervals, branches extending naturally into surrounding space, growth unfolding slowly and without intervention. Sounds became more intermittent, soft and distant, arriving occasionally and fading quickly into extended spans of quiet, which now dominated perception and established a gentle, underlying rhythm. Pathways remained intact and clearly defined, though surfaces bore fewer recent impressions, shaped now by infrequent movement rather than habitual travel. Air circulated gently at long intervals, carrying familiar traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering longer before dispersing, contributing to the prevailing calm. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing minor variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had once been maintained more actively now occurred with reduced frequency, sustained by inertia and repetition rather than deliberate attention. Time passed through continued stillness rather than marked events, measured in long stretches of unchanged conditions. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, noticing continuity rather than contrast, sensing that systems remained functional though operating more quietly and with longer pauses between action. Nothing indicated disruption, urgency, or resolution. The environment simply continued, deepening intervals of calm and minimal activity, carrying the subtle, unbroken drift onward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and ongoing, as the gradual progression extended naturally into the next. Moments of gentle adjustment. As time continued to move without emphasis, the environment remained settled into long intervals of quiet persistence, holding its shape while internal rhythms slowed further and became less distinct. Light still passed gently across walls, floors, and open spaces, lingering longer than before, its movement subtle enough to blend into the background of perception. Surfaces carried the soft accumulation of stillness, thin layers of dust and faint texture settling naturally, becoming part of the surroundings rather than changes to be noticed. Objects stayed where they had last been placed, accessible yet rarely engaged, containers closed, fabrics folded, tools resting in familiar positions, sustaining a sense of order through continuity rather than use. Water followed its established paths steadily, reflecting subdued patterns that shifted gradually with light and air, the motion predictable and calm. Vegetation persisted quietly, leaves holding their form for extended periods, branches extending slowly into available space, growth unfolding at a pace that required no attention. Sounds arrived only occasionally, distant and soft, dissolving quickly into longer stretches of quiet that now dominated the atmosphere. Pathways remained visible and intact, though impressions of recent passage were rare, shaped more by time than by movement. Air circulated gently at wide intervals, carrying traces of warmth, moisture, and earth that lingered longer before dispersing, reinforcing the prevailing stillness. Structures continued to stand without adjustment, supported by their existing balance, allowing small variations to persist without consequence. Processes that had once required regular attention now unfolded, quietly and less often, maintained by inertia rather than active care. Time passed through duration rather than sequence, measured by how long conditions remained unchanged. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, sensing continuity instead of difference, noticing that systems remained present while operating more quietly and with longer pauses between motion. Nothing suggested transition, urgency, or resolution. The environment simply continued, extending its persistence, allowing intervals of minimal activity to lengthen further, carrying the subtle, unbroken drift onward, unobtrusive, unresolved, and gently receding into deeper stillness, where presence remained, and change became increasingly difficult to distinguish. As time continued without emphasis, the spaces that remained began to feel wider, quieter, and less defined by activity. Structures still stood where they had long been, their outlines steady against the sky, though their presence no longer suggested routine or purpose. Light moved slowly across stone, wood, and open ground, settling briefly before shifting on, its passage gentle and unhurried. Surfaces carried the softened marks of long exposure, weathered textures, faint discolorations, subtle layering that accumulated gradually and without interruption. Open areas stretched between walls and paths, holding still air and extended silence. Unshaped by movement, objects remained where they had last been left, their edges softened by time, their function less apparent, integrated quietly into the surroundings. Water collected in shallow basins and followed natural depressions, reflecting muted light in slow, repeating patterns, undisturbed and steady. Vegetation extended gradually into available space, roots settling, leaves resting, growth unfolding without direction, responding only to light, moisture, and season. Sounds were rare now, distant and indistinct, dissolving quickly into long intervals of quiet that filled the spaces completely. Pathways remained faintly visible, their lines softened, guided more by memory than by use. Air moved gently, sometimes remaining still for long periods, holding traces of earth, moisture, and stone, lingering without urgency. Structures showed no sign of adjustment, standing as they were, allowing minor changes to persist without response. Processes continued quietly where conditions allowed, unfolding at a pace that required no observation. Time passed without markers, measured only by gradual shifts in light and shadow. Awareness could drift slowly through these spaces, encountering openness rather than activity, sensing that presence had thinned, leaving behind form without intention. Nothing suggested return or conclusion. The environment simply remained, extending its quiet continuity, allowing space, stillness, and subtle change to coexist without direction, unresolved and ongoing, as the silence settled deeper into the surrounding landscape. As time moved on without notice, the spaces continued to open, their quiet expanding as activity faded further into the background. Structures remained where they had long stood, edges softened by exposure, their outlines steady yet increasingly absorbed into the surrounding landscape. Light drifted slowly across stone and earth, lingering in shaded corners before easing onward, its movement subtle enough to feel continuous rather than changing. Surfaces held the marks of long presence, weathered textures, gentle erosion, faint layers settling one upon another, forming patterns that required no attention. Open ground stretched between walls and pathways, filled with still air and extended silence. Undisturbed by movement, objects rested where they had last been placed, their purpose less distinct, their forms blending quietly into the environment. Water gathered in shallow pools and traced natural channels, reflecting muted light in slow, repeating patterns that shifted only gradually. Vegetation continued its steady extension, leaves resting, stem settling, roots spreading into available space, growth unfolding without direction or urgency. Sounds were now rare, distant and soft, dissolving almost immediately into long intervals of quiet that dominated perception. Pathways remained faintly visible, their lines softened, guided more by terrain than by use. Air moved gently at wide intervals, sometimes remaining still long enough to feel settled, carrying traces of moisture, earth, and stone that lingered without dispersing. Structures showed no response to these changes, standing as they were, allowing small variations to persist without adjustment. Processes continued only where conditions supported them, unfolding quietly and slowly, without observation. Time passed without markers, measured by the gradual shift of light and the steady presence of shadow. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering intention or direction, sensing that presence had thinned further, leaving behind form without function. Nothing suggested return, renewal, or conclusion. The environment simply remained, extending its calm continuity, allowing stillness and subtle change to exist together, unresolved and ongoing. As the quiet settled deeper into the spaces that remained, as the passage of time carried on quietly, The remaining spaces settled further into stillness, their boundaries defined less by use and more by gradual exposure. Structures continued to stand in place, surfaces softened by long contact with air and weather, their presence steady yet increasingly absorbed into the surrounding terrain. Light moved slowly across open ground and along worn walls, pausing briefly in shallow recesses before drifting onward, its movement gentle and continuous. Textures across stone and earth grew more uniform, shaped by extended calm rather than active change, forming patterns that blended into one another without contrast. Open areas remained undisturbed, holding long stretches of quiet air, unmarked by recent movement. Objects persisted where they had been left, edges rounded slightly over time, their original purpose less apparent, their forms becoming part of the landscape rather than separate from it. Water followed shallow paths and natural depressions, collecting and dispersing gradually, reflecting subdued light in slow, repeating motions. Vegetation continued its gradual spread, leaves resting, stems leaning, roots extending into available soil, growth unfolding according to season and condition rather than direction. Sounds were now rare and indistinct, arriving faintly before, dissolving into extended silence that filled the spaces completely. Pathways remained only as suggestions, their lines softened and interrupted, shaped more by terrain than by repeated passage. Air moved gently at long intervals, sometimes remaining still long enough to feel settled, carrying faint traces of moisture and earth that lingered without urgency. Structures showed no response to these subtle shifts, standing as they were, allowing minor changes to persist without adjustment. Processes continued quietly where conditions allowed, unfolding slowly and without observation. Time passed without markers, measured only by gradual changes in light and shadow across familiar surfaces. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering intention, sensing that presence had thinned further, leaving behind form without direction. Nothing suggested renewal or conclusion. The environment simply remained, extending its quiet continuity, allowing stillness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing, as the silence continued to deepen across the landscape. As time continued to extend without distinction, the remaining spaces appeared increasingly open, their character shaped less by structure and more by the absence of movement. Walls and foundations remained where they had long stood, their edges softened by prolonged exposure. Surfaces bearing quiet variations formed over many seasons. Light drifted slowly across stone, soil, and open ground, lingering briefly before shifting onward, its motion gentle enough to feel almost stationary. Textures blended into one another gradually, weathered surfaces settling into muted tones that required no attention. Open areas held still air and extended quiet, unbroken by footsteps or routine passage. Objects remained scattered lightly across the space, their forms intact yet subdued, their original purpose less apparent, integrated into the surroundings without emphasis. Water collected where the ground allowed, tracing shallow paths and depressions, reflecting dim light in slow, repetitive patterns that changed only with time. Vegetation continued its gradual presence, leaves resting, stems leaning, roots spreading quietly into available soil, growth unfolding without direction or urgency. Sounds were nearly absent now, appearing rarely and faintly, dissolving quickly into long spans of silence that settled evenly across the environment. Pathways persisted only as softened lines, guided more by terrain and erosion than by use. Air moved gently at wide intervals, sometimes remaining still long enough to feel settled, carrying traces of moisture and earth that lingered without dispersal. Structures showed no response to these subtle shifts, remaining steady, allowing minor changes to persist without adjustment. Processes continued quietly where conditions permitted, unfolding slowly and without observation. Time passed without markers, measured only by the gradual movement of light and shadow across familiar surfaces. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering intention or direction, sensing that presence had receded further, leaving behind form without purpose. Nothing suggested return or conclusion. The environment simply remained, extending its calm continuity, allowing emptiness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing, as the quiet spread gently through the spaces that remained. As the quiet progression of time extended further, the spaces became increasingly open and still, their character defined more by absence than presence. Structures remained where they had long stood, edges softened by exposure, surfaces bearing the subtle marks of years without active attention. Light moved slowly across stone, earth, and open ground, pausing in shallow recesses before drifting onward, its passage gentle, almost imperceptible. Textures across surfaces blended gradually, layers of weathering, dust, and natural wear forming muted patterns that required no observation. Open areas stretched between walls and foundations, filled with long stretches of quiet air, unmarked by recent activity or movement. Objects remained in place, their forms integrated quietly into the landscape, edges softened by time, their original purpose less apparent but still present. Water followed gentle courses along depressions, collecting and dispersing slowly, reflecting subdued light in, repeating patterns that shifted only with the gradual flow of time. Vegetation continued its unobtrusive spread, leaves resting, stems leaning lightly, roots extending into soil, growth unfolding without guidance or urgency. Sounds were rare, arriving faintly before fading immediately into extended silence, which dominated the environment completely. Pathways persisted only as softened impressions, shaped more by terrain and erosion than by use. Air moved gently at long intervals, carrying traces of moisture, earth, and stone, lingering in place before gradually dispersing, reinforcing the calm continuity. Structures remained stable, showing no response to these subtle shifts, allowing minor variations to persist without adjustment. Processes continued quietly where conditions allowed, unfolding at a slow pace, unnoticed and unobserved. Time passed without markers, measured only by the gradual shifts of light and shadow. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering direction or purpose, sensing that presence had thinned further, leaving behind form without function. Nothing suggested conclusion, renewal, or return. The environment simply remained, extending its quiet persistence, allowing stillness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing, as the silence deepened steadily across the spaces that remained. As the slow passage of time extended, the spaces settled deeper into stillness, their outlines defined less by structure and more by quiet continuity. Walls and foundations remained where they had long stood, their edges softened, surfaces bearing the faint marks of exposure over extended periods. Light moved gently across stone, soil, and open ground, lingering in recesses before drifting onward, its motion subtle, unhurried, and continuous. Textures merged gradually across surfaces, layers of dust, weathering, and natural wear forming patterns that required no attention. Open areas stretched between structures, holding calm air and extended silence. Unshaped by movement, objects remained where they had been left, their form subdued, edges softened, their original purpose fading into quiet integration with the surroundings. Water flowed along shallow channels and collected in natural depressions, reflecting muted light in slow, repeating patterns that shifted imperceptibly with the passage of time. Vegetation extended quietly, leaves resting, stems leaning, roots spreading into soil, growth unfolding naturally, without direction or urgency. Sounds were minimal, arriving faintly and dissolving almost immediately into long intervals of silence, which now dominated perception. Pathways were softened impressions, shaped more by erosion than passage, lines barely visible. Air circulated slowly at long intervals, carrying traces of moisture, warmth, and earth, lingering without dispersing, reinforcing the quiet stillness. Structures remained steady, showing no response to these subtle changes, allowing minor variations to persist without adjustment. Processes unfolded quietly where conditions permitted, at a slow pace, unnoticed and uninterrupted. Time passed without markers, measured only by the gradual movement of light and the steady presence of shadow. Awareness could drift through these spaces, sensing that form remained without purpose, presence without activity. Nothing suggested conclusion, return, or intervention. The environment simply continued, extending calm intervals of minimal activity, allowing stillness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing. As the silence deepened and space grew further into the quiet that remained. As time stretched on quietly, the spaces settled further into calm, their boundaries defined less by human activity and more by the natural unfolding of stillness. Structures remained where they had long stood, their edges softened, surfaces bearing the faint, gradual marks of exposure. Over extended periods, light drifted slowly across walls, stone, and open ground, pausing briefly in shallow recesses before continuing onward, its passage gentle and almost imperceptible. Textures across surfaces blended seamlessly, layers of weathering, dust, and slow natural change forming patterns that required no observation. Open areas extended between foundations and remnants, filled with calm air and long stretches of quiet, untouched by movement. Objects remained where they had been left, edges softened by time. Forms integrated quietly into the surroundings, their original purpose less apparent but still perceptible. Water followed gentle courses, collecting in shallow depressions, reflecting muted light in slow, repetitive motions that shifted imperceptibly. Vegetation continued its gradual presence, leaves resting, stems leaning slightly, roots extending unobtrusively into soil, growth unfolding naturally, without urgency or direction. Sounds were minimal, arriving faintly before fading quickly into long stretches of silence, which came to dominate perception completely. Pathways persisted as softened impressions, their lines barely visible, guided more by terrain and erosion than use. Air moved gently at wide intervals, carrying traces of moisture, earth, and warmth, lingering quietly before dispersing, reinforcing the calm continuity. Structures remained stable, unresponsive to these subtle shifts, allowing minor variations to persist without change. Processes unfolded quietly where conditions allowed, unnoticed and slow. Time passed without markers, measured only by gradual shifts of light and shadow. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering purpose or direction, sensing that presence had thinned, leaving behind form without function. Nothing suggested return, conclusion, or renewal. The environment simply continued, extending its quiet persistence, allowing stillness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing, as the silence deepened further into the spaces that remained. As time carried on without notice, the spaces grew wider in perception, their character defined less by objects or structures and more by the quiet persistence of stillness. Walls and foundations remained where they had long stood, edges softened, surfaces marked gently by exposure, weathering, and the slow passage of air and light. Light drifted gradually across stone, soil, and open ground, lingering in shallow recesses before moving onward. Its motion almost imperceptible yet continuous. Textures blended subtly, layers of dust, natural wear, and soft weathering forming muted patterns that required no attention. Open areas stretched further, filled with still air and long intervals of silence, unshaped by movement, unmarked by use. Objects remained where they had been left, their forms integrated into the surroundings, edges softened over time, their original purpose less apparent yet faintly suggested. Water followed gentle courses along depressions, collecting in shallow basins, reflecting muted light in slow, repeating motions, shifting imperceptibly with the gradual flow of time. Vegetation extended quietly, leaves resting, stems leaning, roots spreading slowly into available soil, growth unfolding naturally without direction or urgency. Sounds were minimal, arriving faintly and fading immediately, into long spans of quiet that came to dominate perception. Pathways persisted only as softened lines, guided by terrain and erosion more than passage. Air moved at long, gentle intervals, carrying traces of moisture, earth, and warmth, lingering before gradually dispersing, reinforcing the prevailing stillness. Structures remained stable, showing no response to subtle shifts, allowing minor variations to persist without adjustment. Processes unfolded quietly where conditions permitted, slow and unnoticed. Time passed without markers, measured by gradual changes in light and shadow. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering direction or function, sensing that presence had thinned, leaving behind form without activity. Nothing suggested return, intervention, or conclusion. The environment simply continued, extending its consistence, allowing stillness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing, as the silence deepened steadily across the spaces that remained. As time drifted forward quietly, the remaining spaces settled deeper into stillness, their boundaries defined less by structure and more by absence. Walls and foundations continued to stand where they had long rested, edges softened by long exposure, surfaces bearing faint patterns formed over extended periods of calm. Light moved slowly across stone, earth, and open ground, pausing briefly in shallow recesses before continuing onward, its passage gentle and continuous, almost imperceptible in its subtlety. Textures across surfaces merged gradually, layers of weathering, dust, and natural change forming muted patterns that required no attention. Open areas stretched between structures, filled with still air and long spans of quiet, untouched by movement or purpose. Objects remained in place, their forms softened by time, edges integrated into the surroundings, their original function less distinct yet faintly suggested. Water followed shallow channels and collected in small basins, reflecting subdued light in slow, repeating motions that shifted imperceptibly with the passage of time. Vegetation continued its unobtrusive growth, leaves resting, stems leaning lightly, roots extending into soil, unfolding without direction or urgency. Sounds arrived rarely, faintly, and dissolved immediately into long intervals of silence, which now dominated perception completely. Pathways remained only as softened impressions, guided more by erosion and terrain than by travel. Air circulated at wide intervals, carrying traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering before dispersing, reinforcing the prevailing calm. Structures showed no response to these subtle shifts, remaining stable, allowing minor variations to persist without adjustment. Processes continued quietly where conditions permitted, unfolding slowly and unnoticed. Time passed without markers, measured only by gradual shifts of light and shadow. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering function or purpose, sensing that presence had thinned, leaving behind form without action. Nothing suggested return, intervention, or conclusion. The environment simply remained, extending its calm continuity, allowing stillness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing. As the quiet deepened steadily into the spaces that persisted, as the quiet passage of time extended further, the remaining spaces settled into deeper stillness, their outlines defined less by structure and more by absence and subtle continuity. Walls, foundations, and remnants of human presence stood where they had long rested, their edges softened, surfaces bearing faint patterns shaped gradually by exposure, weathering, and the slow movement of light and air. Light drifted slowly across stone, soil, and open ground, pausing briefly in shallow recesses before moving onward, its passage gentle and continuous, barely perceptible. Textures merged naturally, layers of dust, weathering, and erosion forming muted patterns that required no observation. Open areas stretched between structures, filled with long spans of quiet air, unmarked by recent movement or purpose. Objects remained where they had been left, edges softened, forms integrated quietly into the surroundings. Their original function faded, yet faintly traceable. Water followed gentle courses along shallow depressions, collecting in basins and reflecting subdued light in slow, repeating motions that shifted only gradually. Vegetation continued its unobtrusive expansion, leaves resting, stems leaning lightly, roots extending slowly into soil, growth unfolding without direction or urgency. Sounds were rare, arriving faintly before dissolving, immediately into extended silence that dominated perception. Pathways persisted only as softened impressions, guided more by terrain and erosion than by use. Air moved at long, gentle intervals, carrying traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering before dispersing, reinforcing the pervasive calm. Structures remained stable, showing no response to these subtle shifts, allowing minor variations to persist without adjustment. Processes unfolded quietly where conditions permitted, slow and unnoticed. Time passed without markers, measured only by the gradual movement of light, shadow, and air. Awareness could drift through these spaces without encountering purpose or direction, sensing that presence had thinned further, leaving behind form without action. Nothing suggested return, intervention, or conclusion. The environment simply remained, extending its persistence, allowing stillness and subtle change to coexist, unresolved and ongoing. As the silence deepened fully into the spaces that endured, carrying the quiet onward beyond perception, uninterrupted and continuous. And now, as the quiet continues to unfold, the spaces remain gentle and still, their presence uninterrupted by movement or activity. Light drifts softly across surfaces, lingering in corners, stretching along walls and floors, subtle and continuous. Shadows shift slowly with the passage of time, blending seamlessly into open areas, reflecting calm rather than contrast. Objects rest quietly where they have long remained, edges softened by time, forms integrated into their surroundings, their presence steady but unmarked by use. Water traces its familiar paths gently, reflecting muted light, flowing softly along natural channels without urgency or attention. Vegetation spreads unobtrusively, leaves resting, stems leaning, roots extending slowly into soil, growth continuing quietly without direction. Air moves with extended pauses, carrying faint traces of warmth, moisture, and earth, lingering in place before dispersing, maintaining a subtle, constant rhythm. Sounds arrive rarely and faintly, dissolving immediately into long intervals of silence that dominate the environment. Pathways persist only as softened impressions, shaped by terrain and time rather than travel. Guiding perception gently through open spaces, structures remain steady, responding only to the slow passage of light and air, allowing minor variations to continue without adjustment. Processes unfold quietly where conditions allow, unnoticed, slow, and persistent. Time moves without markers, measured only by gradual changes in light, shadow, and presence. Awareness can drift freely, sensing continuity rather than action, form without purpose, presence without expectation. Nothing demands attention, direction, or conclusion. The environment simply continues, extending its persistence, carrying the quiet onward, uninterrupted and ongoing, as subtle rhythms of stillness settle deeply across the spaces that remain. And in this gentle continuity, you may continue to rest, allowing the soft flow of time, silence, and observation to guide your mind towards stillness, without end, unresolved and serene.